What's up, everyone? Are you looking for that one deck that 20 to zeros your opponent in one kick? In this video, we're going to go into our Targon Lee deck and everything you need to know to kick your way to the top of the ladder. Targon Lee is a deck that takes the one-turn kill potential of Lee Sin and amplifies it with Targon. You'll be using the tools in your deck to slowly stall the game until the time to strike is right, eventually kicking your opponent right off the top of Targon's peak. It won't be easy, however, as this deck can be harder to pilot than some of the other top tier decks. Next up, every deck has strengths and weaknesses, and Targon Lee is no different. When you play Targon Lee, you'll almost always have the right moves to counter your opponent. Plus, who doesn't like denying a harrowing or ruination? Additionally, you'll almost always have a way to replenish your resources. With so many cards that generate value, it's hard to fall behind in card advantage. But what about some weaknesses? As good of a fighter as Lee Sin might be, we can't use his Muay Thai skills if we don't draw him. A large pitfall of this deck is being heavily reliant on Lee Sin as a win condition, which is exactly why, as we'll talk about later, you'll even consider keeping him in your mulligan. So one way to help mitigate the weaknesses of any deck is to have good mulligans. What are we keeping and when? You'll want to dig for your early game drops in almost every matchup. Zoe is a must keep. If she connects on the turn 1 with the attack token, you are already in an incredible spot. This is especially important when you're facing some of the aggressive decks that we mentioned. The celestials that she generates can sometimes prevent a lot of early game damage. Generally, you can avoid keeping Lee Sin in your opening hand versus these aggressive decks. In most other matchups, keeping Lee Sin should be considered to ensure that he hits the board in a reasonable amount of time. On the flip side, you'll want to drop deep meditations like a bad habit. They provide no immediate impact to the early game and will not be reduced in cost anytime soon. The idea is to keep cards that allow you to stall the game until you're ready to unleash your Dragon's Rage for the win. Next up, we'll go over our game plan. We'll start with the opener, or early turns of the game, followed by the mid game and then late game. Turn 1 will always be Zoe if you got her. Remember, something like an early moon goat can be game changing. Going into turn 2, you'll want to get down a mountain goat versus some slower decks, ramp for example. Against more aggressive decks such as pirate or discard aggro, you'll want to develop an Eye of the Dragon or Sparklefly. Against decks with more removal like Piltover and Zon, be careful running into removal like Thermo Beam to avoid losing an early eye. Turns 3 and 4, you'll want to be holding on to spell mana if possible. If you are against a region such as Freljord or Ionia, you may want to consider Zoe as a more focused game plan. Similarly, don't count out playing a Zenith Blade onto something like a Mountain Goat or Eye of the Dragon early on. Playing against Go Hard or Shadow Isles, remember to manage your mana efficiently and keep open Nopefy or Deny mana when needed. How about a board-centric deck? Utilize some of the early gems to keep your units healthy. Once you hit the mid game, you'll need to focus on utilizing your mentors and getting down your Lee Sin. You'll want to try getting down a mentor after your opponent's attack token has been used and they've exhausted as much mana as possible. This will ensure that your mentor will survive for a potential open attack on your turn, guaranteeing you the effect. You will typically look to bank 3 spell mana going into turn 6 if you do have Lee Sin, allowing you to protect him with a Bastion or Deny the turn he's played. If you haven't drawn a Lee Sin by turn 7, you'll have to start playing Zenith Blades and Deep Meditations to keep up tempo with your opponent and thin your deck. Protecting your Eye of the Dragon is also important to continue to stall at the game. You'll want to be assembling the pieces to close out the game at this point if a leveled Lee Sin was played. If you still haven't closed out the game by turn 7 or 8, you will now have a leveled Lee Sin on the board and most of the pieces of your win condition assembled. If you don't have quite enough damage, you can use the Muay Thai Master to control the board with Challenger and Barrier for as long as you need to grab that last Zenith Blade or Deny that you might need to win the game. Next up, we have some of the core strategies for Targon Lee. Let's start with control. Most, if not all of the cards in Targon Lee are meant to prevent your opponent from doing what they want. Cards like Deny and Nopefy scream shutting down your opponent and are just outright fun to play. Instead of doing something like keeping up with tempo that your opponent sets, Targon Lee will look to adapt and counter. You will want to keep mana open in many situations to allow more reactiveness. Let them make the first move. Versus slower decks, you can dictate the tempo of the game using cards like Zoe or Sparklefly. Either of these paired with an early Zenith Blade can be devastating. Mentor of the Stones is another superb pairing with both of these cards, and now suddenly we got a sparkly buddy on the field that's a 4/6 elusive with lifesteal. Yes please, sign me up. Zoe and Sparklefly can also be a win condition. You will need to make the determination early on in the game if buffing either with a Zenith Blade and protecting them with a Bastion is the right thing to do. For instance, when playing against decks with little removal such as Fearsomes, keeping Zoe around is great. Remember, any buffs or tools used to protect them means less tools at your disposal for protecting and utilizing Lee Sin later in the game. Speaking of Sparklefly, Lifesteal is a great addition to the deck. Using 2 spells a turn will become your job playing Targon Lee. One that's well worth the effort. Dragonlings routinely keep you in the game and give you blockers to allow you to stick around in those games that you just can't seem to find a Lee Sin. Guiding Touch also helps you navigate turns where it might be hard finding the mana for 2 spells. Remember, Deep Meditation also synergizes with this idea. Finally, we have the finisher of the deck in Lee Sin. You'll want to slowly assemble various buffs throughout the early and mid game to eventually pair with a leveled up Lee Sin hitting the field. Remember, the turn that you play Lee Sin, you will either want your opponent to be tapped out of mana or a Deny, Nopefy, or Bastion on standby. Continuing with strategy, we have some of the key units you'll be using in the deck. As mentioned earlier, Eye of the Dragon is one of the best sustain units in the game and allows you the ability to stuff up the boards with chump blockers versus some of the more aggressive decks. You will generally want to keep your eyes safe, not attacking with them, and sometimes even using a Zenith Blade on them if the time is right. If you do come upon a situation where blocking is needed, you can always heal up with a gem or 2 from Mountain Goat. Since it's changed from 1 to 2 health, Mountain Goat is a force to be reckoned with on turn 2. It can be used as both an offensive and defensive tool, allowing you to pressure your opponent if they do not have any 2 attack blockers or block a fearsome attackers with its 3 attack. The gems that it provides not only synergize with the overall game plan, but can sometimes allow it to heal itself while simultaneously increasing its threat. As with Eye of the Dragon, don't be afraid to buff a Mountain Goat with Zenith Blade if your opponent is running a slower tempo deck. Next, we'll touch on a few possible hot takes for the deck. Spell Thief is a card that has found its way into this deck and can be very useful and annoying for your opponents to deal with. In the mirror match, as an example, you can Spell Thief on a stack of multiple Denies and Nopefys to yoink another Deny or Nopefy. Its use, however, does fall off a bit more later on in the game. Sunblessed Vigor is another card that's not in every Targon Lee deck, but with the rise in Zoe has found quite a nice spot. Saving an early Zoe can sometimes make or break a game. It's also quite useful for saving most of the units played in the deck. Finally, main decked Sonic Waves are always a consideration due to their high synergy with most everything in the deck. The extra 2 attack from the Resonating Strike can be what you need to put Lee Sin over the top. Last but not least, we have some tips and tricks. First, we have Hush. Remember that you can hush your own unit to essentially quote unquote cleanse, for you League of Legends players out there, your unit. This means if your Eye of the Dragon is stunned and your opponent plays a Ravenous Flock, you can unstun the Eye and the Flock will no longer resolve. Similarly, Guiding Touch can be used to negate a Ravenous Flock. You can do the same thing with freezes, however keep in mind that the unit will go back to its base attack and not whatever its buffed attack might have been prior to being frozen. And there you have it, Targon Lee in a nutshell. Remember, you can import this deck or any other deck from the tier list by simply clicking Push to Client and you're ready to play. May you all top deck every card you need, and we'll see you on the ladder.